The smell of antiseptic is something you never forget once it's been in your nose at the worst moment of your life. I was 28 years old, lying in a hospital bed 3 days after having my appendix removed. And the first thing my stepfather said when he walked through that door wasn't "How are you feeling?" or "I'm glad you're okay." He looked at me the way you look at a broken appliance. Something that was supposed to work and wasn't. And he said, "You need to get back on your feet. We're not running a charity here." I remember the ceiling tiles. I counted them while he talked because it was the only way I could keep myself from crying in front of him. 14 tiles, a water stain in the corner shaped like a boot. The flicker of the fluorescent light above the door. I didn't know that in about 4 minutes I was going to be on the floor. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this started in that hospital room. It started 3 years earlier, at my father's funeral, in the parking lot of a church I'd been baptized in as a baby. My dad died in February. Heart attack, no warning, no long illness to prepare us. One morning he was there, the next morning he wasn't. And my mother and I were left standing in a life that had been built around him, not knowing how any of it worked without him in it. My mother. I'll call her what she asked me to call her, my whole life mom, because that's who she was before all of this changed her, was 53 years old when my father died. She'd been a homemaker for most of their marriage. She knew how to run a household, how to cook, how to stretch a budget, how to show up for everyone around her. What she didn't know was how to handle contractors, how to read a mortgage statement, how to file taxes alone. My father had handled all of that. She used to joke about it. It stopped being funny the month after he was buried. My stepfather, whose name I'll keep out of this for reasons that will become obvious, came into our lives through my mother's church group. He'd been widowed 2 years before, or so he said. He was 61, well-dressed, soft-spoken in public. He brought her flowers. He sat with her at Sunday service. He helped her navigate some paperwork she'd been avoiding for months, and she cried telling me about it because she said it felt like someone had finally lifted something heavy off her chest. I was cautious. I want to say that clearly. I was not the daughter who immediately embraced him, who was just so happy mom had found someone. I watched. I asked questions. I Googled his name. What came back was unremarkable. A retired property manager, no criminal record, some community involvement. He seemed fine. My gut said, wait. But my gut had also said a lot of things in the fog of grief that year that turned out to be wrong, so I talked myself into giving him a chance. They got married 14 months after they met. I stood at the front of a small reception hall and watched my mother laugh in a way I hadn't seen since before my father got sick, and I chose to believe that this was good. That was my first mistake. The first sign wasn't dramatic. That's the thing no one tells you about this kind of person. They don't start with the big moves. They start with something so small, you almost feel embarrassed to mention it. He started talking about money within 6 weeks of the wedding. Not in a cruel way, not at first, just observations. The way mom handled finances was emotionally driven, he said. She reacted instead of planned. He wanted to help her build better habits. He'd been managing properties for 30 years. He understood cash flow in ways most people didn't. He suggested they combine their accounts to simplify things. Mom mentioned it to me over the phone, and I said gently that she should keep her own account. She laughed and said I was overthinking it. Maybe I was. She was an adult. It wasn't my marriage. Within 4 months, her name was the secondary account holder on what used to be her own checking account. He'd framed it as a tax thing, something about joint filing and linked accounts. She went along with it. I didn't find out until much later. What I did notice was that she stopped having lunch with her friends as often. Then she stopped entirely. He didn't forbid it. That's not how it worked. He'd just ask where she was going, who she'd be with, what the purpose was. He'd wonder aloud whether Sandra from church was really the kind of influence she needed right now, given everything she was processing emotionally. He said it with a therapist's tone. Caring. Measured. It made my mother feel like she was being looked after, and it made me feel, when she relayed these conversations, like I was watching someone slowly replace all the windows in a house with painted-on ones. I started calling her more. She started answering less. When I asked her about it, she said she'd been busy. She said he liked it when they spent their evenings together. She said she was happy. I asked her once, point blank, Are you happy, or are you saying what keeps things peaceful?" She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said, "Honey, not everything is as complicated as you make it." I let it go. I was 26 years old, and I didn't know what I was looking at. By the time I was 27, I was seeing her maybe once a month. He always had a reason for why she couldn't make plans. A prior commitment, a health thing of his, some household project that needed her. When I did see her, she seemed fine on the surface, but smaller somehow. Like she was taking up less space than she used to. Then I noticed the supplements. She'd been healthy her whole life, my mother. She walked every morning, she ate well, she had her annual checkups and came back with results her doctor called boring in the best way. But that year, she started being tired all the time. She started having headaches. She'd forget things mid-sentence in a way she never had before. When I mentioned it to her, she said she'd just been sleeping poorly. She showed me a lineup of vitamins and supplements he'd started her on, something for hormonal balance, something for circulation support, a handful of others I didn't recognize. I'm not a doctor. I had no training to look at those bottles and know what I was seeing. What I had was a feeling in my chest, cold and specific, that I couldn't name yet. I took a photo of the labels when she left the room. I told myself it was just for my own peace of mind. I looked them up later that night, alone in my apartment, and one of the combinations made me sit down and read the same sentence 4 times. Taken together in certain doses, 2 of those supplements could cause chronic fatigue, cognitive impairment, and persistent headache. Not dangerous enough to send someone to the emergency room. Dangerous enough to make a healthy woman feel like she was falling apart. I called my mother's doctor the next morning, asked to come in and speak with someone about a concern. I want to be clear that I had no proof of anything. I had a photo of some bottles and a feeling. The nurse I spoke with was kind but measured. She said she'd flag it for my mother's next appointment, encourage her to come in. She reminded me that she couldn't discuss my mother's file with me directly. I understood. I sat in my car in the parking lot of that medical office for 20 minutes before I could drive. 3 weeks later, I was in the hospital. The appendix pain had been building for a day before I finally admitted to myself it was something real. I drove myself to the emergency room at 11 o'clock at night, called my mom from the waiting room, and heard him answer her phone. He said she was asleep. He said he'd let her know. I said it was urgent. He said he understood. She didn't come until morning, and when she walked in, she looked like she hadn't slept, like she'd been crying, like she'd had some kind of argument that had taken something out of her. She held my hand and didn't talk about it. I didn't ask. I was in surgery by 6 a.m. When I came out, I was in a shared recovery room, groggy, with an IV in my arm and a nurse checking my vitals every hour. My mom stayed for most of the day. He came in the late afternoon. He walked in the way he always did in spaces that weren't his, like he was assessing them, like he was calculating something. He stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me and said, "How soon before you can go back to work?" I told him I just had surgery. He said he knew that. He asked again. My mother was sitting in the chair by the window. I watched her look at her hands. I told him it would be a few weeks, that I needed to recover. I told him my doctor would have a timeline. He said, "Your mother can't be running back and forth to this hospital every day. She has responsibilities." I said I hadn't asked anyone to run anywhere. He said, louder now, "You need to stop acting like the world revolves around you. You're 28 years old. You need to start contributing instead of expecting everyone to drop everything every time something happens to you." The woman in the other bed was pretending not to listen. I could see it in the stillness of her. I said as calmly as I could manage through the pain medication and the fog of recovery, "I'm not asking anything of you. I'm in the hospital. Please lower your voice." He stepped closer. I saw my mother look up. I don't fully remember the exact sequence. I remember him leaning in. I remember his voice dropping in a way that was somehow worse than the yelling. I remember him saying something about how I'd been nothing but a disruption since the beginning and that it was time I started acting like an adult. I said something back. I don't remember what. Something short. Something that was probably the wrong thing to say to him in that moment, though I maintain that there was no right thing. What happened next happened fast. His hand came across the side of my face before I even registered that he was close enough to do it. The sound was loud in the small room. My head snapped to the side and the IV line pulled and I went. The rail on the hospital bed gave way, or I was already sitting up further than I realized, or the impact was harder than I've allowed myself to fully think about. I went off the side of the bed and my shoulder and hip hit the floor, and I stayed there because I didn't have the core strength 3 days post-surgery to get back up. There was a ringing. There was White. The woman in the other bed was yelling for a nurse. I remember the sound of his footsteps. I remember my mother's voice saying his name once. Sharp, the way you say something when you finally see what you've been not seeing for years. I remember the door. I remember 2 nurses coming in within what felt like seconds. I remember looking up at the ceiling from the floor of my hospital room and thinking, with total clarity, I have to remember everything about this. A nurse crouched down next to me. She asked me my name. She asked if I knew where I was. She said very calmly, "Someone has already called security." I found out later that the woman in the other bed had also called 911 from her cell phone before the nurses arrived. I will be grateful to that woman for the rest of my life. He was escorted out of the building by hospital security and met by 2 police officers in the parking lot. They took his statement there. They took mine in my room, with a nurse present, and I told them everything. Not just what had happened in the last 15 minutes, but the supplements, the accounts, the isolation. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photo I had taken weeks earlier. One of the officers, a woman about my mother's age, wrote everything down without reacting. When I finished, she closed her notebook and said, "Is there anything else you want us to know?" I said, "My mother is still in this building. Please check on her." He was charged that evening with battery. And I want to say that clearly for everyone who has ever watched a story like this and wondered why nothing happened, why the law didn't step in. It happened. It happened because there were witnesses, and because I had documentation, and because one stranger in a hospital room decided to make a phone call. Charges were filed. He was not allowed back in that building. My mother, within 48 hours, was connected with an advocate through the hospital's social services program. I won't pretend the next part was simple. It wasn't. My mother had to sit with what she'd watched happen. She had to sit with what she'd watched happen. She had to sit with the years before it. She had to reckon with the accounts and the supplements and the friends she'd lost contact with, and all of that happened slowly, painfully, in the way that things like this always do. There's no clean moment where the fog lifts. There's just one morning where you notice she sounds a little more like herself, and then another and another. The supplements were flagged by her doctor after I shared what I'd found. Her own physician reviewed the combination and had a conversation with her about it. I won't say more than that because I am not a doctor and I don't want to overstate what I know. What I can say is that she stopped taking them, and over the following months the fatigue and the headaches and the forgetting mid-sentence got better. Not all at once, but better. He pled out to a reduced charge. He received probation and mandatory counseling. I know some people reading this will feel that's not enough, and I understand that. There were days I felt that too. My attorney told me the outcome was better than average for a first offense with no prior record and no permanent injury. I wrote down that phrase, no permanent injury, and I kept it in a drawer for a long time before I threw it away. What I want you to take from this is not the legal outcome or the hospital drama, because honestly, those are almost the least important parts of the story. What I want you to take from this is the vitamins. I want you to think about the moment when a person who loves someone, really loves them, is paying attention, notices something small and strange and files it away. I want you to think about the photograph I took in my mother's kitchen when she left the room. A photograph I almost didn't take because I told myself I was probably overreacting, probably paranoid, probably reading too much into a row of bottles on a shelf. That photograph ended up in a police report. Coercive control rarely announces itself. It doesn't start with a hospital room. It starts with a suggestion about finances that sounds like help. It starts with a question about where you're going that sounds like concern. It starts with a supplement that makes you tired enough to stop going places, to stop pushing back, to stop being the person you were before. If you are reading this, and something about this story feels familiar, not the dramatic parts, but the quiet parts, the small parts, the that's probably nothing parts, I want you to pay attention to the feeling in your chest that knows the difference between probably nothing and something. I know the difference now. I paid for that knowledge in a way I wouldn't wish on anyone. My mother lives 20 minutes from me. We have dinner on Sundays. She started walking in the mornings again, and sometimes I join her, and we don't talk about him. We talk about her garden. We talk about a trip she wants to take. She laughs at her own jokes the way she used to when I was a kid. It is not a perfect ending. There are things she lost in those years. Friendship she hasn't fully rebuilt. A confidence in her own judgment that is still, slowly, coming back. The ending is not perfect, but she is here and she is herself, and I am 29 years old, and the two of us are learning what the future looks like when it belongs to us again. That's enough. Right now, that is more than enough. I've thought a lot about what made the difference. Not in a dramatic way. Not looking for a turning point I can point to and say there, that's the moment everything changed. Life doesn't really work like that. But when I look back at the sequence of things, the photo I almost didn't take, the phone call I almost didn't make, the stranger in the next bed who didn't have to do anything and did something anyway, I keep coming back to one idea: small choices accumulate. They pile up quietly, in one direction or another, until one day you look around and realize the pile has become something that matters. I was not a brave person when this started. I want to say that because I think people hear stories like mine and imagine the person telling it had some quality they don't have. Some sharper instinct, some stronger spine. I didn't. I talked myself out of what I was seeing for months. I told myself I was overreacting. I chose the easier interpretation of things that deserved a harder look because the harder look was frightening and the easier one let me sleep at night. What I learned, slowly, in ways that cost me, is that paying attention is a form of respect. Respect for yourself, for the people you love, for the truth of what's actually happening in front of you. My mother is a good woman who trusted someone who had studied how to be trusted. That's not a failure of her character. It's a failure that was engineered carefully over time by someone who understood exactly how to exploit a person's grief and goodwill. The moment I understood that, really understood it, not just intellectually but in my chest, was the moment I stopped feeling guilty for not catching it sooner and started focusing on what I could still do. The supplements are what I think about most. That small, cold feeling I had in my chest, standing in her kitchen, looking at a row of bottles. I almost dismissed it. I almost put my phone back in my pocket and told myself I was paranoid. What stopped me was a decision, conscious or not, to take my own perception seriously. To say, this feeling is information. I will treat it like information. That's the thing about intelligence, real practical intelligence, not test scores, not degrees. It's the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable observation long enough to find out whether it means something. Most people don't. Most people look away because looking away is easier. I looked away for a while too. But eventually I didn't, and that mattered. And the woman in the next bed, I didn't know her. I still don't. She was a stranger who heard something happening and decided it was her business. She didn't deliberate, didn't weigh her options, didn't wonder whether it was her place. She just acted. That's what integrity looks like at the most basic level. You see something wrong, and you do the thing that's in front of you to do. My mother is building herself back. It's not a fast process, and it's not linear. Some weeks are harder than others. But she is doing it, steadily, with the same quiet determination that I watched her apply to everything difficult in her life before someone worked very hard to take that quality from her. It didn't work. That's the part he didn't account for. She was still in there. I'm 29 years old and I know things now I didn't know before. I know what coercive control looks like in its early stages. I know that cruelty rarely introduces itself honestly. I know that the most important thing you can do for someone you love is stay curious about them. Keep asking, keep noticing, keep showing up even when they tell you everything is fine. And I know that the floor of a hospital room, at your lowest, can be the clearest place you've ever been.